We're gonna have a little bit of a discussion / reaction. I got recommended a video from someone that we've watched in the past, and I started watching it because it sounded interesting. And then halfway through the video, I noticed that they were making or bringing up some interesting points, so I wanted to watch it together with you guys. The video in question is this one from Sunny. If you guys remember, if you were here, Sunny is an OCG duelist who's been posting videos in response to some of the recent OCG ban lists, specifically after this last Forbidden Limited list. Basically, the immediate response was some people really liked it and some people really felt like Ryzeal was just going to be the best deck by far now and just going to be tier 0 and all that kind of stuff because it wasn't hit as much as the other decks. The only hit to Ryzeal, I think, was Bonfire to 1. Now this player made a reaction to that ban list and they called it like one of the best ban lists of all time, I think. Yeah, OCG player celebrates best ban list ever. They were very hyped about it. They were very happy with this ban list. And then came this OCG metagame report, which is obviously showing 40% Ryzeal. I don't know how the feeling is in the OCG about this, but like the people in the TCG looked at this breakdown and were like, haha, obviously Ryzeal tier 0 now. That's what you get for not hitting it on the last Forbidden and Limited list and so on. So see, the list ultimately was terrible, is what people have been saying. And this is a response video to that, essentially. Let's hop right in, let them take over and talk about it a little bit, because they do bring up some very interesting points. I think they are relevant for the TCG, for us as well, because it's a lot about how we talk about the game in general, how we think about the game, and how we complain about the game as well, right? Like, those are some interesting topics that I felt like were worth talking about. So let's hop right in.
Before I start, I just want to say that I am just one player. The OCG has many players, each with their own background and values, so I do not speak for the entirety of the OCG, especially when there are not only so many differences between players, but also so many differences between regions as well. So if you are a TCG player trying to use my videos to put down other OCG players, please don't do that, because I've been getting comments saying that my videos are being used to invalidate other OCG players. I really want to talk about the first Road to the King post for this format, because there's so much negativity when I read Western social media about this format, and that doesn't make too much sense to me, because it's like you all are getting mad for us when I think most players are quite happy right now. I guess it would make more sense to me.
This is the Yu-Gi-Oh community in a nutshell. Not everyone, of course.
If people over here were sad and Western players were being empathetic, but it sort of just feels like people are already upset and using our format to justify their anger. That's just my feeling. I don't know if that's definitely the case, and I do feel bad.
Maybe it is just social media in a nutshell. Yeah.
For TCG players, because I was also crying last format. Even if you scroll down to the comments, the top comment all say Ryzeal tier 0. So toxic deck tier 0. Konami is bad for creating tier 0 meta. To me, it feels like the meaning of tier 0 has been lost. Tier 0, based on numbers, to my knowledge, was 65% or greater topping conversion, and it doesn't even have to be that scientific. You could also just base it off of vibes.
This was the point in the video already where I was like, yep, that's going to make for an interesting discussion, because this is 100% true. The way we talk about tier 0 nowadays, I feel like people are using this term way too frequently without knowing exactly what it means. And also, people are using that term, they're using it with a negative connotation every single time, right? There's a best deck that has to be tier 0, and that has to be terrible, and the game is being mismanaged because there is a tier 0 deck. Every single time there's a deck breakdown where any deck is like above the rest, people are like, that's crazy. We've got a problem here. That is a very inherent issue with how we think about card games and Yu-Gi-Oh specifically, right? And how we evaluate formats. Because if your measurement is, oh, if there's a deck that's better than other decks, then the game is in a bad spot. I have bad news for you, because then any card game, not even card games, any competitive game is probably gonna suck for you 99% of the time, because turns out in competition, there is usually something that is better than other things. Sometimes it's a slight margin, sometimes it's a bigger margin, but that is very, very common. That does not necessarily mean it's tier 0, and it's also, most importantly, does not necessarily mean it's bad.
And I think that's not invalid. To me, tier 0 is when there is very apparently one deck that is much better than every other deck, and you should be playing that deck if you want to be competitive.
Yes. They also brought up another point. People try to use statistics to determine what is tier 0. There is no number for this. Some people think it should be 60% pop cut representation. Some people say 50. Some people say 65, 70. There is no set number for how successful a deck has to be in order for it to be tier 0. In my opinion, I don't think it's a good practice anyways to tie that sort of thing to numbers. As much as I love to look at statistics and all that kind of stuff, I think making out whether a deck is tier 0 or not, to just look at the raw numbers on how a deck is performing is not the way to go. I would love to be in the position to just be able to pinpoint it to numbers. I don't think it's possible. It's very non-scientific to just say like you have to go about it vibes based, but unironically, I think in this case, it is something that you have to do, right? The numbers can be a good indicator. They can help you do that 100%. If someone tells you this deck is tier 0 and you can show them like a breakdown where it's only 5% of top cut, you can use those numbers to indicate that what they're saying is not true. Or if a deck is putting up 50% of top cut consistently, 60%, 70, whatever it is, you can go out there and argue, hey, this deck is probably tier 0. I want to make that argument, but you also have to factor in other things, right? Because something that also matters is how many people bring a deck to a tournament to begin with. The conversion rate into top cut is super important as well. Like maybe it's very hard to access the deck. For example, I know it's an example from a couple years in the past, but when Minerva was just a price card, Lightsworn with Minerva, we will never know from raw statistics whether that deck could have been tier 0 or maybe was tier 0 because there simply wasn't enough people having access to that card. Let's say it's only 10 people who are playing a deck with a YCS price card in it because of how hard it is to find that kind of card. 10 people enter a tournament with that and all 10 make top 32. That is an incredible conversion rate, probably indicating that the deck is very powerful, but they still don't even make up 30% or like roughly 30% of top cut because they're only 10. And so there is other factors. Obviously that's an extreme example, right? But the raw numbers do not indicate whether a deck is tier 0 or not, and especially they don't indicate whether a format is good or not.
Next, I want to talk about how I personally read results. When you look at a pie chart like this, it is very useful, of course, but there are a lot of other factors to consider. Things such as how many people enter a tournament.
Another thing that you need to understand, these numbers, they are not proportional to each other, right? Because Ryziel has 40% and Malice has 13% does not mean Ryziel is exactly 3 times as strong as Malice. And that is not only true for top cut breakdowns, it is also not true for the play rate of a deck. For example, if there are 2 decks out there that are relatively close to each other in power level, right? Let's say on a scale of 1 to 100, one deck has a power level of 80 and the other one has a power level of 78. They're pretty close to each other and they're both pretty good. And the community knows about this. They perceive them as both very good, but one is slightly better than the other, right? The play rates are not going to reflect that. The play rates are going to be way favored into the better one, especially on a competitive scale. Because on a competitive level, why would you play the 78 one if you could play the 81? The 81 is not going to be slightly more represented. It's going to be way more represented. From the popularity, it might look like that deck is incredibly oppressive, but it's not really, right? It's just slightly better. So it's not going to like oppress all the other decks out of the format. If you want to play something else, maybe the 78 one is more fun to you. You can play the other deck if you want to. You don't have to make up a gap of like, oh, this other deck is infinitely stronger than my deck. I'm not saying, by the way, that that is 100% true for the OCG right now. I'm just saying that that's what this player that we're listening to right now, that's what they feel like. They feel like Ryziel is good. Ryziel might even be the best, but Ryziel is not as far above the rest as something like Snake Eye or Yubel was. It's not as oppressive as Snake Eye as Yubel was, and therefore it feels like with other decks you have a better chance of competing with it, and that is good. That's very desirable, right? Like the way that this player is feeling right now is something that ultimately is very positive, right? It's a very positive outlook for us right now. We've gone through a full year where Snake Eye and Yubel have increased the power level of one card combos to such an amount that they felt very oppressive and very strong, and pretty far above the rest, honestly. Like if you were playing a rogue deck into those kind of decks, it felt like you had to make up so much ground in order for it to be playable. They felt very dominant. And what they've managed to create in the OCG, it seems like, is they have managed to bring down that power level. And that's a hard thing to do as well in card design, is how do you make new decks that people actually want to play? So they have to be good, but they still need to have a lower power level than what Snake Eyes and Yubel had. right? That's not that simple, but it is possible.
Ryzeal in particular is one of the easiest strong normal decks that has been printed in a long time. Regardless of what you think about Snake Eyes, not everyone could play Snake Eyes well. That deck was rather difficult and you would get punished for things like linking your Flamberge early or playing into Nib and these types of sequencing errors, while Ryzeal is very much a deck where the order of your cards does not matter that much. There are starters that are better in punishes, but I'd say most games you don't get punished for messing up.
This is a factor about a deck that it doesn't say all that much about the overall health of the game, but this is ultimately subjective. Some people don't like when decks are too easy and powerful. It makes it feel like sometimes you're losing to players that maybe aren't as good or something, right? That can happen. I can get behind that. I think ultimately for modern Yu-Gi-Oh, I think these kind of decks are quite important, honestly. It doesn't necessarily have to be the best deck in the format, but genuinely, I think people that are not able to put as much time into Yu-Gi-Oh to learn like 20 different spreadsheet lines and all that kind of stuff, they should still have a viable option, at least, is my personal opinion. Ultimately, I think even if a deck is fundamentally relatively easy, there's gonna be spots where your misplay matters. There's even spots where your misplay matters when you're playing Tenpai, even when you're playing Flu. All those decks, you know, I've played against people that play those decks because they're easy and they misplay and they lose because of it. That still happens.
As for Ryzeal specifically, I think that Ryzeal is actually quite comparable to Kashtira, and this is probably why I thought Kashtira sucked too.
I do think this is a good comparison in some ways, not in all ways, but the format after Tearlament format, when Kashtira was the deck in the TCG that put up the most results by far, I want to say. That was a format that, looking back at it, honestly, I think was completely fine. That format, you could essentially play not whatever you want, but Kashtira on a competitive level didn't really bully out that many decks in the format because, quite simply, Kashtira's end board was highly breakable. It was very possible to play other meta decks, pop with other meta decks, and even make meta calls where you went into a tournament playing purposely not Kashtira because you thought there was something else that was better, right? I, for example, throughout the entirety of Kashtira format, have not entered a single YCS with Kashtira, and I topped like multiple of them with different runic variants and stuff like that because it was just like, okay, well, they end on a Rise Hard plus a bit of non-engine, so I'll just like, I don't know, activate Talents, activate Flashing Fire, whatever. It was fine. It wasn't as oppressive as trying to go second into Snake Eyes or try to go second into Yubel. It was a different situation. So was Kashtira the best deck overall, results oriented? Yeah, probably. Kashtira was definitely the most popular, but was Kashtira oppressive and stopped you from playing other decks? Not really. People hate the you have to draw the out argument, right? You know what drawing the out means when you're deck building? It means that there is an out. When your opponent makes the Yubel board, have fun drawing the out because there isn't one. That's even worse when the only out you can think of is like sphere mode and that's it. At least I can put some outs into my deck for Kashtira format and that makes my other decks more viable. If you can't even think of an out, then you've got a problem. And I think that is roughly what the OCG is experiencing, at least from their explanations, right? I haven't played this format specifically, but that's what they are trying to get across, is that they think Ryzeal is kind of like that, right? It's a good deck, maybe even the best deck, the most popular deck, but not necessarily bad for the game, right? And I think that is something that people need to learn. Diversity does not always equal good, and less diversity does not always equal bad in terms of deck distributions and deck options, right? Like sometimes there's a format where the best deck is very popular, but is fine to play against and actually fun. And then there's formats where there is 8 different options that are all kind of good, but they all kind of suck to play against. And there you go. You've got an example of a diverse format that isn't that fun, and you've got an example of a format with very popular decks, but that's actually quite good. So I think inherently tying this idea of, hey, this deck is now the most popular, so it's gotta be a problem and this game has gotten to be mismanaged, I don't think it's a good argument. I don't think it's true. It takes a little bit more work and more effort and more like time to think about a format, unfortunately, before you can really criticize it. I think you need to look at the decks that are popular, not just the numbers, not just the fact that it is the best deck, and then immediately criticize it. I think you have to dive a little bit deeper. I think you actually have to play the format and actually try different stuff out and actually find out whether the deck is fun to play against or not fun to play against, or oppressive or not oppressive. Because like even Tearlament format, right? A format with very little diversity at competitive scale. It was Tearlaments and then maybe a couple of Floowanderees and Sprites because they could play Shifter. Not that much diversity. Was it a good format? Yeah, it was. I'm happy that it didn't last for too long because I do recognize that some people really value deck diversity, and that's okay. Ultimately, that is also subjective. What I just said is subjective. I think it was a good format. If you don't agree with that, that's fine. It's not as simple as this one deck is popular, so the format has to be bad. And I personally think this is also another one of those issues. Like, I would so much rather go to a tournament with 40% Ryziel than I would go to a tournament with 40% Yubel. I would even go to a tournament with 40% Kashtira before I would go to a tournament with 40% Yubel. In an instant, I wouldn't even think about, I'm going to the Kashtira YCS every single day of the week. And that example alone, to me personally, already shows that the number alone does not define whether the format is good or not. You can replace the two decks in your head with two other examples, right? You can use Snake Eye 40% and Sprite 40% or something, and then just think about, is your answer always the same? Are you always going to be like, nah, they both 40%, most popular deck, doesn't matter where you go because they both suck? I don't think that's true. I think you can always think of two examples of two different formats with equally popular decks where one is better than the other. So the number itself does not matter that much. OCG player here, Ryziel isn't really a tier 0 at the moment. Why it got represented that much is Ryziel is easy to pilot. Exactly, thank you. Now, unfortunately for you, all the TCG experts in the chat that have already played an astonishing amount of 0 Ryziel games disagree with you. So you as an OCG player, unfortunately, you don't really have that much to say here. Yeah. Having played the OCG format a bit, I'm way happier to fight Ryziel than Malice. That's what it sounds like, to be honest. It sounds like Malice is a much more oppressive / combo heavy deck. In some ways, it's actually good that Ryziel is more popular than Malice, or in a lot of ways, actually.
But yeah, the conclusion is that these decks are the decks to beat, and they are, and that's also why I'm not playing them in tournament. Like I said earlier, when I enter a tournament 5 to 6 rounds of Swiss, there's probably 3 or 4 Ryziel and Malice players every time. And the way current works is that there's cards that get one-shot every single deck. Ryziel has to play into D-Barrier and Scythe going second. Its board itself gets obliterated by Slayer when they go first. You can probably make something every game, but the most frequent board you make is low power, and you lose games to one-shot cards decently often because everyone is hard prepping for you.
So this is another interesting question that I feel like is good to talk about as well. If there is a best deck or perceived best deck in Yu-Gi-Oh, is it actually smart to bring that deck to a tournament, right? Which is something that I've personally decided against a lot in the past couple of months, or even the past 1.5 years or something. Like I said, I never brought Kashtira during Kashtira format. I actually also didn't bring Snake Eyes or Yubel to the YCSs when those decks were super. Actually, we didn't have a YCS during Snake Eye format at all, but like I didn't bring Snake Eyes to Euros, for example. There is times where the best deck in the format is just good and you should play it from a competitive perspective, and sometimes there's times where the best deck in the format has weaknesses too. I guess my main takeaway is, in a tier 0 format, or not even tier 0, but even when there is a best oppressive deck like Snake Eyes or Yubel, if the mirror is not that good, I really don't like to play them. That's me personally. I hate playing the Yubel mirror when I feel like it's very much down to the dice roll, which is, for example, why I had no issues playing Tearlament in Tearlament format, because that deck I felt like had a good mirror match. If that matchup is bad or not fun, then I'm not going to have a good time in a tier 0 format. That also carries over to more diverse formats that don't necessarily have a tier 0 deck, but maybe just a best deck, right? Like, for example, Snake Eye or Yubel are not really tier 0 decks, although Yubel in the last format before Rage of the Abyss, vibes based, pretty close. Competitively optimal in those formats is probably to just bite the bullet and play the deck like Snake Eye or Yubel. But at the end of the day, I also do want to enjoy myself when I go to tournaments, and if I don't enjoy a mirror match, then I don't want to play the deck, right? You always play out of the box shit. See, that's not true necessarily. That is just something that I've been doing a lot this year specifically. 2024 was a year where I felt like the mirror match with the best decks wasn't very good. A lot of hand trap mini games, a lot of trying to go first and make up an unbeatable board and all that kind of stuff that I personally don't like. And so I did not like to enter tournaments in 2024 with the best decks. I've had no issues in previous formats to enter with top tier decks. It just depends on the format for me. Obviously, if I'm not a fan of the best deck, then I'm more inclined to try to make a meta meta call. I'm not a machine that goes into every tournament like I'm gonna know what gives me the best odds and I'm gonna play it every time. Sometimes I just sit there and I just can't bring myself to play a certain deck because I don't like it, or because I don't exactly think it gives me the best odds, right? Like I try to get as close to that as possible, right? I try to always figure out what gives me the best odds while also enjoying it. Sometimes I succeed, sometimes I don't. That's fine, right? I just try to get as close as possible as I can. Skill expression does not equal fun to watch. That is another good point. I'm guessing that's in regards to tier limit format, right? There's a lot of different discussions we're having today. And that's why I say I'm happy it didn't last too long, because I can 100% understand why watching tier limit mirrors was not that fun. The people at home are going to care about seeing different decks and understanding what's going on, and tier limit format wasn't that great for it. And that's why a lot of these things, when you subjectively prefer something, does not mean that as a whole it is objectively better, right? Like there's different factors. Like a format can be super fun to play in, but maybe the viewer experience suffers, right? And Yu-Gi-Oh is a game that consists out of so many different like aspects, right? So many different people playing this game. Only because you particularly like a certain thing about a format does not mean that everyone has to agree with it. Most things have a positive for some people and a negative for other people.
Memento does not lose to the common big hand traps. This is like the thing my last video got the most pushback against. It does not summon from deck 10 times.
Okay, first of all, why is Jaja on the screen right now in some OCG player's Twitch chat or something? And why, out of all things, is the person being called out for yapping like crazy, particularly Farfa? Actually, scratch that. I get it. Of course it's Farfa.
I'm not going to pretend that Memento is immune to Maxi. That would be delusion. But the reality is that every Yu-Gi-Oh deck pretty much loses to Maxi, unless you're specifically talking about like Fluandries or like Runic Sun.
Okay, so the process we're going through right now, these are questions that you should ask yourself every single time you pick a deck for a tournament. And this is why meta calls are possible. In some formats, they are more likely to work out. In other formats, they are less likely to work out. But overall, you never want to be the one autopiloting, going like, oh, this is the most popular deck. It must be the best, so I'm going to play that, right? You always want to go and analyze the format. What kind of decks are people playing? What kind of non-engine cards are people playing? What kind of boards are these decks making when they go first? What do people perceive to be the most popular and best decks? They're going to play the non-engine that's good against that, and so on and so forth. That's exploitable behavior. That is stuff that, because how the format develops, if you can make the right call at the right time, you can maybe have a deck that's better than what everyone thinks is the best deck right now, right? That can happen. That is why deck building is so important and deck choice is so interesting sometimes. Now, in some formats, this is something that you should try to do. In other formats, that is something that's not going to be possible. I remember during tier limit format, I was trying to do this a lot. I was sitting there weeks before tournaments trying to figure out a deck that could maybe exploit the fact that you're going to play against only tier limit throughout the entire tournament. Because if you could have done that, maybe you would have the best deck in the room for like one tournament until the idea is out there and people start preparing for it and so on and so forth, right? I mean, Paleo in 2017 is a great example of this, where for like specifically 1 or 2 tournaments, that deck was insane because it just slaughtered everything in the format and no one knew about it. These kind of things can happen, and if you are able to make those calls, you potentially end up just winning a tournament with it.
If they play it right, you should still lose engine to full board, but that's just how Yu-Gi-Oh should be. If you only draw engine and they make a full board, then you should probably lose if they execute properly. Otherwise, their deck would be extremely bad.
I guess this is debatable. People always use this as an argument. If you need to draw hella non-engine to keep up with what your opponent is doing, then it's bad, which to an extent I agree. At the same time, it is kind of true, right? If you just draw 5 engine cards going second in Yu-Gi-Oh, that has always kind of sucked. It's hard to compare it to older formats because in older formats, we didn't really make the distinction between non-engine and engine as much. I don't remember when this started. I don't know, Zodiac format, and you draw 5 Zodiac cards going second, you're gonna lose the Zodiac mirror. I think the point where it starts becoming problematic is more like when I draw a balanced hand, like a starter and an extender and 1 or 2 non-engine maybe, like a quite balanced and a solid hand in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, right? If that leaves me with no chance because my opponent just plays through 2 hand traps like it's nothing, or my opponent makes an end board that doesn't even lose to 2 board breakers plus starter plus extender or something like that, maybe then you could start arguing like, okay, these boards are too oppressive because I'm going second against Yubel and I'm drawing like Dark Ruler, Talons, Snake Eye Ash, and Bonfire, and I still have no chance. I'm using Yubel as an example a lot. I'm scarred. No, I'm telling you, if you draw Dark Ruler, Talent, Starter, Extender, and Cash Tira format, you're gonna have a good time. Overall, I think we can definitely agree that the power level from Yubel and Snake Eyes into Ryziel format has gone down. I think that is good and that is important. I feel like the takeaway from 2024 Yu-Gi-Oh! Is that there's been cool decks that got released in 2024. They were mostly overshadowed by Yubel and Snake Eye. And I think the power level in 2024 was slightly too high. And we need to tone that down, which is not simple. The fact that they've managed to do this with Ryziel, honestly, I think it's impressive. I think the fact that a mid-range deck that looks like it's actually fun to play with and fun to play against and doesn't really oppress other decks out of the format is the best deck in the OCG right now is pretty cool, actually. I'm just hoping that we can start 2025 also in the TCG on a little bit of a lower power level kind of ground. If it's at the cost of Ryziel being the best deck for a while, then I'll happily take it.
But yeah, that's about it for this video. I'll probably not make these again since there's so many great YouTubers that are covering Road of the King every report. But I wanted to just clear the air real quick on negativity because I think it's not really reflecting reality in my opinion. And if you think I'm coping, that's, fair enough, I might be, but this is what I actually think.
I thought this was a very interesting breakdown and I think it made for an awesome discussion. A lot of things here that I'm glad we talked about. And I'm gonna be honest with you, I'm looking at this from all the things I'm hearing about Ryziel. I think it looks completely fine. If you liked it, if you think they got a nice style when talking about the OCG, feel free to subscribe to them. And yeah, shout outs to them for making it because I thought it was very interesting.